So how do you judge the character of a man you've never met and never will meet? Do you do so by his actions during the time he was alive? By what his family say about him, his friends, his ex-colleagues? Or by complete strangers who have never met him? This police officer was born on the 18th of September 1924 in Red River County in Texas, USA. 1939, his family moved to 6 miles southwest of Clarksville, which is the small town we're about to visit. So that means his early years were brought up in the Great Depression, and like millions of other hard-working American men and women and their families, they had to struggle through farming. No tractors, they used horses, picked cotton by hand. He liked to fish, he liked to hunt with his friends. At some stage, his family actually split. His mother and father got divorced. They used to visit Clarksville on a Saturday, watching the odd movie, which I think at the time cost a dime to get in. Just hanging out with his friends on a Saturday as youngsters. Then the Second World War came along, and of course for America that started in 1941 with the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. So his father then left to do war work, which left this young man with an increased responsibility to look after the farm. Now, if he'd wanted to, he could have carried on doing that on a deferred service, because cotton was a vital commodity being used for all sorts of applications, clothing, webbing, I guess a lot of different applications. So he could have carried on with a deferred service, but being the character he was, he wanted to join the war effort. He was a patriotic young man. He saw his friends going off to war, either as volunteers or being drafted, and he wanted to be part of that. So one day he just upped and went and joined the army. Also, he wanted to be in the sharp end of war, so he joined the paratroopers, the airborne troops, obviously one of the elite troops to have joined. During his war service, he joined in July 1944, so he'd be 20 years old when he joined, and he joined the 17th Airborne Division. During his service, he saw action in Germany towards the end of the war. He won the Bronze Star. He was going to be awarded a Purple Heart, which he turned down because he didn't think he'd earned it. He fell carrying a heavy machine gun and injured himself, and he didn't think that warranted a Purple Heart. At the end of the war, he came home, and like many men, of course, from all different countries, after being in intense activity, coming home, and that they've now moved the number 32 bus to a different time of the day, probably didn't seem that important compared to perhaps how it had before he left. He married his childhood sweetheart, Marie, in 1946, and then did a series of jobs. He got a grant from the government, as many servicemen did. He tried his hand at agriculture. It didn't really work out. He got a job with some of the larger companies, but it really wasn't working for him. And he probably, again, like many veterans, missed to a certain extent some of the although obviously hard and terrible at times, the excitement of being in the service. He had a friend who joined the police force, So, in June 1952, he joined the Dallas Police Force, badge number 848. Now, being a policeman in Dallas in the 1950s, I guess, was a tough job, and I guess it's a tough job now. And by extension, being a police officer anywhere in America is a dangerous and tough job to do. A couple of instances that highlight that in his service, the man we're talking about, was he was called to a domestic disturbance. That's a routine occurrence for any police officer, probably anywhere. But when they got there, the wife was screaming that her husband was going to kill himself or kill her. And while they subdued this man who probably had mental issues, his partner was stabbed in the shoulder with an ice pick, and our officer was stabbed in the stomach and the right kneecap. In fact, tip of the knife broke off into his kneecap, which troubled him a lot. Eventually he had an operation and he had to have part of the kneecap removed and a steel plate inserted. Same year, in September 1956, he had a much more dangerous encounter, similar to the one in one sense that actually ended his life. Him and his partner stopped a drunk, and he recognised him, our officer, that he looked like a wanted man he'd seen from a wanted posted. When they were talking to the man and got him outside, he suddenly pulled out a .25 semi-automatic pistol, pulled the trigger close to our guy's head, but it didn't go off because he'd still got the safety on. Our man and his partner then ended his drinking problems by pumping 7 bullets into him and killing him. So they're two of the dangerous situations he had to compete with. So the years move on. Initially he had 1 son, and then he had 2 more children, so now he's got a family of 3. So apart from his police work, he then takes on 2 other part-time jobs to ensure he's providing for his family. So these to me give me an indication of the sort of person he was. He was a dedicated family man when you read about him. We're just looking at the memorial in Clarksville for all the service persons who lost their lives. Quite a large number for the size of the place during World War II. But also we have World War I, of course, but also Korea, Vietnam, and even peacekeeping. So that's the memorial to them. Our man, of course, escaped that fate because he'd survived the war. So the years roll by. He becomes a very experienced police officer. He doesn't go for promotion. Maybe that was perhaps lack of education in one respect, but also he was happy doing the job he did. We then switch forward to November 1963. So he's been on the force 9 years now. He's become a very experienced patrol officer.
You are in the Oak Cliff area, are you not?
Lines removed.
You will be at large for an emergency that comes in.
So that's the last radio message from the officer we're talking about. He's cruising in his Ford Galaxy 500 patrol car in the Oak Cliff area of Dallas. And this is the junction of 10th and Patton at about 1:14 p.m. Earlier there had been a major incident in the city about 45 minutes earlier, and a radio message had gone out to look out for a particular type of suspect, possibly carrying a rifle, a white male. And as he cruised across this intersection, he did spot a man on the sidewalk on the right hand side. Why he stopped him will never be known, possibly because of that radio message or possibly because other reasons. It can even be that the man was walking this way towards the camera, saw the patrol car and did a 360 and started to turn back. That perhaps then highlighted the police officer that something was going on, so he pulls him over. He pulls over to the side of the road on the right hand side, and the houses are different now to they would have been in 1963, and he talks to him through the window, or the vent window, the little side window before air conditioning, so you could get air into the car without opening the main window. He obviously wasn't totally satisfied with the answers, so he gets out his patrol car, and as he walks to the front of the patrol car, this man pulls out a 38 special Smith & Wesson revolver that he'd had under a jacket he was wearing, a windbreaker, an Eisenhower type jacket, and shoots 4 times. 3 across the bonnet of the car, in rapid succession, according to an eyewitness that saw it. Of those shots, one hit his button on his uniform, forced it in. That might not have been that serious a wound. 2 of those other shots could have proved fatal, but the 4th shot really sealed the deal for our officer. Fractured his skull, cut across his brainstem, and came to rest inside his skull, and that almost certainly killed him instantly. One eyewitness thought that the gunman had actually started to walk away and came back and delivered the 4th shot execution style, but that's not for certain. There could have possibly even been a 5th shot. After that, the gunman then immediately starts to eject empty shells from his revolver, which does show some sort of previous training. Or he didn't just panic and run off. He started to empty out his revolver and possibly reload. Some of those shells were found on the corner house. This is not the right house, but in that area. 2 women came out of the house and saw him, plus there was a woman on the side of the road who saw him, and a man had crossed the intersection in his truck. All those later identified the suspect at a lineup. He then goes across the hedge there, and there was a taxi driver just around the corner. He heard the man say something to the words of "poor damn cop" or "poor dumb cop" repeated. He was one of the people who also identified him in the lineup. Coming down this road, some people working in a car showroom type building came out. They saw him, they called out to him, but he didn't really reply. He obviously crossed the road probably to avoid them, and he's now walking down this road towards Jefferson Boulevard at the top. Right at the top on the left-hand corner was another car showroom type building, 2-story, and a number of men in there looked out and saw a man coming down here fiddling with a pistol and then sticking it under his waistband. So there was a number of witnesses there. So this is Jefferson Boulevard. This suspect then turned right along here. Probably altered his demeanour in terms of his pace. He perhaps slowed down a little bit so not to be obvious. By this time an ambulance has reached the officer and started to take him away. Our suspect is walking down here, and he turns off this road and he comes to a lot which is now fenced in, but in the day it was open with cars. Takes the jacket off and ditches it under the car, which is later found. There's a alleyway here which goes through, but he didn't come down this way. He came down the main road because he was actually followed at one stage by the men from the car showroom on the corner until they gave up. But it's possible that he then, having ditched this jacket under this car. He then carries on, and we'll see the other side of the alleyway in a moment. Jacket was later linked by the FBI, or fibres on the jacket were later linked to a suspect who was then arrested for the murder of the police officer. So it's likely that having ditched the jacket, he then comes down and carries on down that alleyway, but at some stage comes back onto Jefferson Boulevard. He's walking along there and he approaches and starts to look in a shoe shop, which is no longer there. Looking in through the window from the outside, standing in the sort of entranceway with a glass front, but obviously looking over his shoulder and noticing now police cars are racing up and down Jefferson Boulevard because one of their colleagues has been shot. Now the manager of the shoe shop notices him and sees he's acting in, a bit of a nervous, suspicious manner. He's heard on the radio about the shooting of the police officer. So as the man moves on, he follows him out and he sees him dip into the cinema. And the receptionist, the cashier, is taking the money. He doesn't see that because she's standing out on the roadway looking at all this police activity. But the shop manager did. They then call the police. They then start to search this cinema, which we'll be seeing. And as they're going row for row, there's a few people in there. I think there's some school children playing hooky because there's a war movie on. And as they go row to row, one of the officers comes across this particular suspect. And as he does, he jumps up and shouts something like, "It's over," or "all over," and punches the officer in the face. Not unnaturally, he punches him back. At the same time, the guy pulls a gun out of his clothes and tries to shoot him. But the police officer grabs the gun and it fails to fire, perhaps even because he has the web of his hand between the hammer and the cartridge. Anyway, he's then subdued and dragged out and taken off down to police headquarters. So that's another view of the cinema. You've probably guessed already that it's November the 22nd, 1963. What had happened on that day? Well, of course, JFK had been assassinated. The man that's drawn out the cinema, although charged, never stood trial because he himself was murdered 2 days later. And that man was Lee Harvey Oswald. And he was accused of killing the police officer we're talking about, who is J.D. Tippit. 39 years old, with a young wife and 3 young children, and that was his last day on patrol. And there's a memorial to him at 10th and Patton, where he died, explaining what had happened that day. There was a number of witnesses who identified Oswald as the shooter. Two witnesses who'd seen the shooting. One was the lady on the corner, another was the man that had drove over. 3 others had seen him leave the scene. And this is a memorial to J.D. Tippit near Clarksville, where he was born. And again, this is laying out the actions of that day, and potentially by his death brought some other closure in terms of what had happened to JFK, because of course Lee Harvey Oswald was found to be implicated in the murder of JFK by the Warren Commission and other commissions. But leaving that aside, this story is more about J.D. Tippit and his devotion to duty and the life he gave for the citizens of Dallas. Beautiful countryside, as we can see. This part of Texas, where he was from. And he was then also buried, I believe, on the same day as President Kennedy. And we'll be viewing his grave in the cemetery. Which is Laurel Land Memorial Park. Also says something about the Kennedys as well, because on the evening of J.D. Tippit's death, Robert Kennedy, of course himself was murdered later on, actually phoned his widow Marie to offer his sympathies, and that says a lot about him as a person, considering the grief he was going through. And Jackie Kennedy also sent her a very nice letter which she responded to, also particularly mentioned that her husband would have an internal flame, and she considered that J.D. Tippit would also be part of that remembrance as well. So this is the main police memorial in Dallas, and of course J.D. Tippit's name's on here. I think I counted when I was there over 90 names since the formation of the Dallas Police Force of officers who died in the line of duty. So that's quite a moving tribute to all the police officers who have actually died. Now, where J.D. Tippit is buried, actually next to him is another police officer who was gunned down. That was a officer called Carl Jackson Cook. He'd been shot 3 times. He left a wife and 2 daughters, and that was in May 1972. And he's buried next to J.D. Tippit in Laurel Land Memorial Park. So as we say, this is the police memorial in central Dallas. And it's quite a moving tribute to how it's been created for all these officers who've lost their lives. Again, back to Oswald and evidence, apart from eyewitnesses, which are, sometimes seem to be unreliable, but of the 15 people involved in one way or the other looking at events, either at the actual shooting or later a man running away, I think of 15 of them, 11 identified Oswald as being the gunman, either through lineups or photographs. And also the 38 caliber revolver Smith & Wesson was linked, that the man was carrying in the cinema was linked to be the gun that had shot Tippit. I think, in the words of the examiners, to the exclusion of any other firearm in the world. But having said that, we have to say that Oswald was allegedly had killed Tippit, because he was never brought to trial. He himself was gunned down, so we should say that he was allegedly the man, because unless he's been brought to trial and been proven, there's always a question mark there. And I know some people do have question marks about his guilt. The revolver he used, or the revolver carried by the man in the cinema, which was Oswald, had originally been sold to the British under a British caliber and had been modified. So we're in Laurel Land Memorial Park, On the left we have the headstone of the officer killed in 1972, called Jason Cook, and then we have J.D. Tippit's headstone, and next to him is his widow Marie, who died in 2021, so after 58 years she was reunited with the boy she'd married from Red River County. So there J.D. Tippit lies, badge number 848. So to the Tippits and to the man lying next to him, who perhaps isn't that well known as J.D. Tippit, only perhaps by his relatives, let's hope you all rest in peace.